So, Chris, thanks so much for joining me to talk about the Model 3 Challenge, which is what I think is maybe the first EV race series in the world, focusing with the Tesla Model 3. Could you just give us an overview of what that series is, please, and what racing means in this context? Because it's not wheel-to-wheel racing, is it? It's more hot lapping.
Yeah, that's correct. So basically, the Model 3 Challenge was kind of born out of the idea of, creating a series that focused on electric vehicles, that was also, accessible to folks without being overly expensive. And we wanted to focus on making it such that, it wasn't the guy who had the most money who's going to be able to win, but rather make it a competitive environment for, people where this may be their only car. I think the Model 3 is really the first platform to bridge that gap between affordability and practicality on the track. And it's got a really good aftermarket following as well. So there's a lot of upgrade parts available that I just haven't really seen a whole lot of on other platforms. So I definitely think that it was the logical choice to go with as far as what platform we chose. And as a electric vehicle enthusiast and someone who also has had a lot of enjoyable time on the track, it really sort of piqued my interest of how do we take this car that is a lot of fun for me to go out and drive around by myself, but share that experience with others and make it competitive. Because I think that for a lot of people that's sort of the natural progression, right? You start out on the track doing a lot of just sort of track days and learning how driving technique and how to drive your car, and then the progression eventually is towards more of a competitive format. But I just don't think that there's a huge market at this point in time for putting a roll cage in an EV. So what we tried to do is come up with a format that allowed you to sort of get that feel of wheel to wheel, but without the risk that is inherently involved with wheel to wheel racing. So it's kind of a unique format in that regard.
Just for everyone else's benefit, when we talk about wheel-to-wheel racing, what that means is cars line up on a starting grid and they do X many laps, and it's the first one to complete 10 laps, 5 laps, 15 laps, whatever else, and you're battling for position as you go into a corner. Now, what you're talking about when we say racing is something slightly different to that, lower risk. So talk us through the format.
Yeah, so basically, it incorporates a lot of the aspects that you would find in a wheel-to-wheel race. We still have a grid order. The cars all go out in basically a line. So there is a gap between the cars, but they are all effectively following each other at the start of the race. You have a flag to indicate the beginning of the race.
Oh,
Um,
so just to go back, so I read your rules. You do have a qualifying session. So
mhm.
so presumably the weekend would start with a practice session where you just go out for, I don't know, you've got an hour's worth of track time, you go out as long as you want, right? Something like that. And then
Exactly,
after,
yes. So we do have practice.
yeah, and then you'd move into a qualifying session, presumably where you've got an hour on track and it's the fastest time gets pole position. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep. So the grid order is based off qualifying times.
Yeah, okay. And then yeah, the bit which I didn't get was the actual race itself. So everyone's on the grid, but there's a gap between the cars, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So we do put a small gap between the cars. It's usually about five, car lengths, give or take.
Okay.
It's marked with a cone. But once the, flag drops, so basically the
Yeah.
person, in pole position crosses the start finish, everybody's good to go at that point.
Oh, so it's a rolling
So
start. It's
exactly,
a
it's a rolling start.
rolling start. Okay, right. Yeah, okay. All right. And then so after that, is it okay, so everyone's so you've gridded up, you've done a formation lap, you've got about 5 car lengths. The first car passes the start finish line and then it's race on.
You got it.
Okay. What are your passing protocols? Anything or any rules?
Yeah, so that's really the significant difference. So in wheel to wheel racing, you end up a lot of times with multiple cars, either diving into brake zones or
Yeah, yeah,
trying to
yeah.
hit a corner, side by side. So the way that we've sort of gotten around that is we have what we call detection zones, and generally there's two of these detection zones on the racing surface. and they're put between, a straight. And so basically, if one car enters the detection zone, say
Yeah.
in the lead, and then there's a following car, if they're both in the detection zone at the same time, the following car basically, earns the pass. And then at the next long straight, the lead car has to basically give the pass.
That's fantastic. Okay, so how do the drivers know that they're
So that's a great question. So we actually tried out. Let's see if I get a little bit more light in here. So we tried out a few different things, and we had some mixed results initially. But basically, what actually ended up working best was getting everybody on effectively like a Zoom or a Google Meet call.
yeah.
And because you don't have a loud exhaust or an engine, you can actually just have your phone connected via Bluetooth, and you can hear
Right.
pretty well, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So we
yeah,
just get everybody on a call. We've got people basically monitoring the detection zones,
yeah,
watching to see if, both cars enter at the same time, and then
yeah.
we literally just call the drivers, and that's how they know whether or not to give the pass. And it actually worked surprisingly well. We really
Yeah.
had no issues with it.
I think that's genius, because it would. I mean, when you're on a normal hot lap system track day, you really get a thrill of chasing you down. I'm sure we've all done our best times when there's someone in front, especially when they're in a faster car. You get into saying you're chasing you down, but here it's actually more of a race. But as you say, you don't get that risk of launching a high risk braking attack into a corner, and or doing an outside overtake and someone understeering into you. So I think that's genius.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, and isn't this interesting? Because the cars are quiet, so you've leveraged that. I mean, I know in the average race car, even a road car, 7,000 RPM, you can't hear anything of it. What? And then of
Yeah,
course
exactly.
you've got the excuse. Oh, I didn't hear that. You know what racing drivers are like, right? Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's yeah, yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. So, okay, how many laps do you get out of a battery? And because I also saw in your regulations, you're not allowed to go onto the track with 100% charge, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of a difficult question to answer as a generalization, and the reason why is, if you think about the battery, it's almost you've basically got this energy storage, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So the more power you're running and the longer you're on the throttle, obviously the less time you're going to have. However, there's also sort of a secondary problem, which is that it's there is a point where the car will limit the amount of discharge. So if you think of it sort of like a bucket, right? And you have a bucket full of water, and that's your energy available. And all of a sudden you start pouring out a bunch of water from this bucket. It needs to basically maintain a certain level in that bucket. It can't all just flow out at once. And so that's basically what we refer to as current limiting. So, on a car that's prepared for the track, if you just go out there with full power, you're probably going to get about 8 minutes, depending on the track, before it starts to limit power. Now, the good news is it doesn't completely, like kill the power, but it will start to reduce it down until, you're running about like half of its maximum. And so the way that we've sort of worked around that is by limiting the power to basically a static level. It's just under 300 horsepower. And by doing that, we're able to avoid that limit for, about 15 to 20 minutes. So we can run a 15-minute race at consistent power. And generally, a 15-minute race, you're going to use about 40% of the battery. So, if we didn't have this kind of power limiting thing going on, you could do a 30-minute race, but it's juggling a lot of variables. And it's interesting too, because if you take a stock car on stock tires, it's really kind of a non-issue. But as soon as you add like a 10% more time on throttle, it really starts to hit that limit a lot faster.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah. So, what you're saying then is that the time on track is actually limited by thermal management as opposed to battery capacity.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because it's not even so much a thermal problem. So it's not that like the battery is overheating, which is what the screen sort of displays and what I think a lot of people think of as being the issue. So it's not even so much that the battery or the motors are overheating as much as basically this cell can only discharge so quickly. And
Mm.
so the battery management system is limiting how fast you can discharge the cell, basically to prevent damage. Now, I think the reality of the situation is that there's probably a pretty good buffer there. And, if Tesla were to allow it, it would probably be, you know, less of an issue. But of course, the batteries are under warranty for 8 years. So they're trying to, I'm sure,
Yeah.
prevent a bunch of warranty replacements. So
Exactly, yeah. And if I was a Model 3 owner, I think I'd want to limit. I mean, the Model 3 does not hurt for power. So reducing it to 80% to have a longer battery life and take care of it, to me, just makes complete sense. And if everyone's the same, then it's identical, right? And we all know that what's important is the racing, not so much. And if you're doing, I don't know, 200 k's down the end of the straight or 180, it doesn't really make that much difference. But it makes a big difference in power, but not to the thrill. So all of that makes total sense. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, I like to think of it similar to like Spec Miata or something to that
Yeah.
effect. It's really more about the racing than the outright speed.
Yes,
So I don't
absolutely.
think that the power limiting degrades from the experience.
No, absolutely not. Do you use regen on track? Because I'm thinking that obviously you're doing a lot of braking events, that's a lot of energy to harvest. And I'm sure we've all bought so many brake rotors and pads and replaced so much fluid in our time. It would be nice to do less of that. But on the other hand, doing that is going to add heat into the system. So do you turn regen on or off when you're doing this stuff?
So it is helpful to limit or completely disable the regenerative braking at full power. You can get maybe an extra 30 seconds to a minute out of the car. But at the power limit levels that we're running, you can pretty much run the regen at 100% and it won't impact that power limiting. And the nice part is that you are taking a lot of heat out of the brakes. So everything in the braking system lasts longer.
Mm.
And I think that it's also a little bit more confidence inspiring because you're not relying solely on the mechanical brakes to do all of the work. And the other thing too is that the way that we have it set up is the torque split is sort of and you had talked about you can adjust this through the UI as well. But as sort of like the default state, it's running about a 60-40 split, rear to front. But because neither of the motors are maxed out, their ability to recover the energy doesn't really result in them overheating. Whereas again, at full power, you would eventually run into the motors getting hot, and generally it starts to move more power towards the front, which can change the driving dynamics of the car quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay. So what track or tracks do you race at?
So last year we did 3 events. We ran at Lime Rock Park in Connecticut. We ran at Laguna Seca in California and Willow Springs in California. And for this coming season, we're adding 3 more events. We've got Thunder Hill in California, and we'll be doing Mont Tremblant up in Canada, as well as Cannon Motor Club, which is up in New Hampshire. So
Um, what sort of lap time does a Model 3 challenge car get, and what would be an equivalent? Would it lap the same as, I don't know, a stock WRX STI, or would it go as quick as just give me a sort of a nice car that would kind of do similar lap time to one?
yeah, so at Laguna Seca, our fastest guys were running in about the 141s in Model 3 Challenge power limited trim. Which is pretty comparable to like a new M3,
Okay.
in relatively stock form. So it's even with the limited power, they're actually surprisingly quick. The instant torque out of the corners really benefits it a lot, and despite the fact that they're fairly heavy cars, having the center of gravity so low really I think helps the you know cornering ability quite a bit. It corners far better than you'd ever expect, given the weight of the car.
One of the problems with EVs, and this is the one that all the anti-EV people like to jump all over at the moment, is fire. Now, without
Yep.
getting too much detail into fire, the fact is that the fire risk for an EV is, or on a fire impact, is different to an ICE vehicle, what with thermal runaways, etc., etc. So, without getting into technicalities of that, it does require different equipment and training to manage that risk. So, what's the situation with you guys? Have the tracks you run at have to have specialized EV equipment, training, or what's going on there?
So we've been, pretty lucky so far, and the tracks that we've run at have been, pretty EV friendly. Certainly in certain parts of the United States, there are tracks that I don't think are EV friendly. But the ones that we've run at, generally, we've had a conversation with the track management in advance just to kind of let them know what we're doing, and let them know sort of what our plan is in the event of an accident. So I think that, one thing that people tend to overlook is that the chances of a fire occurring in an EV, statistically speaking, are considerably lower than an internal combustion engine car. Um, and I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that, when fuel ignites, it's sort of an instant reaction, right? It goes from stable to flames within seconds. Whereas with a battery, that's really not the case. Generally, there's, a chemical reaction that has to take place, or some sort of a, short circuit, which results in heat and then smoke and then fire. So it's a progression that takes time. And in most instances, we're talking 15 to 20 minutes before, you go from impact to fire, which should give the safety crew of any, competent track plenty of time to get the car off the track. And I think, what I've heard from tracks is that's their biggest concern, is the car's on fire on the racing surface. And
Yeah.
that's a, legitimate concern. But, in 99% of cases, there should be more than adequate time to get it to pretty much a gravel pit. That's really the best solution. If you can just have somewhere to tow the car and leave it that's, not flammable around the immediate area, obviously grass would not be ideal. You kind of just want to let it simmer out, which could take a long time, to be fair. But the other thing we've done beyond, having these kind of preliminary discussions of what the plan would be, is we do have a kill switch that is mandatory on all the vehicles. And it's accessible to, both the driver, if they're able to get to it, or the safety crew. And it's on the windshield cowl. So, we notify them of that. We got a big sticker pointing to it. And if the switch is flipped, it will force the contactors in the battery to open, which will basically isolate the battery from the rest of the car.
Modification. So let's say someone's got a brand new, or new to them Tesla Model 3, don't want to take it on track. Now, for an ICE vehicle, the first thing I would say to them is do your brakes, specifically the pads and the brake fluid. Rotors maybe a bit later on. And, if it's your first few days, don't worry about the tyres, but pretty soon after that, you're going to want some track-oriented tyres. And that would be my recommendation for car modifications, to have a good time as opposed to go faster. Now, I saw on your regulations you've got a whole bunch of things, including upper control arms, etc., etc., etc. What is the minimum required to, I guess, take a Model 3 to the track, and then also what's the minimum required for the Model 3 challenge?
Yeah, so I would say the minimum required to go to a track day, so someone who just bought the car,
Yeah.
really would be pads and fluid. That's sort of the number one thing.
Yeah.
The brakes, unfortunately, because 9% of owners are rarely ever going to use the brakes. They're just not really rated for track use, even in the performance models. I mean, they'll do it for some period of time, but they really need to be street friendly and corrosion resistant and low temperature. So they just don't handle track duty particularly well. So getting good pads and fluid in there is definitely step one. And if you just want to go have a good time, I think that's really all you need to get out on the track.
Okay, and now for the Model 3 Challenge, what extra do you put on that?
So basically, beyond that, the only thing that we require is a cooling party controller. And so what that controller does is that's actually what allows us to limit the power. And obviously, it wouldn't really be very fair if someone was out there at full power while everyone else was limited. Although ultimately, I think they'd end up going slower
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you round it out over the 15 minutes. But yeah, that's really the only other requirement beyond the safety items, which is that we call it the H-fill disconnect that will force open the contactors. We do strongly recommend a tow hook, although it's not for the rear, although it's not required. But yeah, that's really all you need. If you want to just run the car, you know, just get out there and participate. Pads, fluid, that disconnect. That's the bare minimum. And then from there, most everyone who's participated, of course, goes on to do. I'd say camber arms are kind of the next most important thing, because the outer edges of the tires with the weight of the car and the factory camber, which is very little and has virtually no adjustment, the edges of the tires just get wasted really quickly. So unless you really like buying tires and you want to spend all your money on them, that would certainly be the next thing I'd do. And then of course, the stock tires are okay, but if you're running track days and you want to be competitive, a nice set of tires is next on the list. And I'd say to sort of round it off, the stock dampers are okay, but they definitely leave a lot to be desired, especially like high speed stuff. They're not great. So, coilovers is sort of the, I'd say, final piece to the puzzle. And everything beyond that, there's plenty of other things you can do. A lot of like bearing and arm upgrades on the suspension, but nothing that I would say is going to add a whole lot of speed at that point. It's just kind of incremental stuff.
The tires, do you find tire wear is greater or less than the equivalent ICE vehicle because the vehicle is a bit heavier, or is it just you don't really notice it?
I would say that on average, it's probably a little bit higher with these cars. Because again, they are pretty heavy, they're pretty torquey. So I would say you're probably gonna go through tires about 20% faster than a comparable ICE vehicle. But it's not significantly worse either.
Yeah, okay. So as ever, there's horses for courses. Some costs are going to be higher than ice, some costs are going to be lower, etc. Now, speaking of costs, let's talk about charging. So everyone's finished the race, they're coming back. The adrenaline is high, the battery is low, and you got to let the adrenaline go. It's a pity you can't just put the adrenaline straight into the battery because that would be a good thing. So how many cars do you have in a race, and how do you handle them all wanting to charge at the same time?
Yeah, so last year we had about 10 per race, and I'm hoping next year we can expand that. But it is very dependent on the track. So Laguna Seca had on-site charging. They have superchargers literally, right in the pits, and that was fantastic. I mean, it was just so easy. You literally would get off, of grid, and you just go plug in 200 feet away. There was 8 supercharger stalls there, and because they charge pretty fast on a supercharger, it was really just a complete non-issue. I mean, you could go from end of race to ready for the next one in 45 minutes. So that is definitely the ideal state, and Thunderhill has a similar setup. But obviously, that's not the case for every track. I hope one day that will be, but we're not there yet. So other tracks like Willow Springs, the supercharger was about 20-25 minutes away. So there was a fair amount of time that unfortunately competitors would spend driving back and forth to the supercharger to top off in between sessions. So it is one of the, I'd say, pain points of tracking an electric vehicle at this point in time, is that you do have to take into consideration charging constraints. A lot of tracks do have like 50 amp RV outlets, which work decently well to recharge between sessions, but they're just unfortunately not fast enough to really keep up to the demand. So I do think that DC fast chargers are sort of a necessary evil, but they don't have to be terribly fast either. Like 50 kilowatts would certainly be an appropriate, charging rate. But unfortunately, DC fast chargers have still not really reached that point of being affordable, the way that AC chargers are.
Yeah, okay. So, so just going back to the state of charge, does everyone start with state of charge at 80% or 100%? I recall reading something in the regulations about that.
Yeah, so for the all-wheel drive vehicles, 90% is basically the maximum they can start with.
Why is
And then
that?
so pretty much it's two things. If you've fast charged an electric vehicle before, as the charge level increases, the speed decreases.
Yeah,
So we just want to not have people feel the need to be sitting there at the supercharger till the bitter end.
right. Okay.
And also, if they need to drive back to the track, we want them to be able to have sort of a buffer to be able to get back and still be at 90%. So that's sort of the logic
Right,
behind
got
it.
it. Yeah.
And then for the smaller battery cars, the standard range specifically, we allow them to charge basically as high as they want, just because they have less energy storage to begin with. So as the state of charge drops, your voltage drops, which means you need basically more current from the motor to keep up the power level. And what we've noticed in the standard ranges is that they start to tail off towards the end of a Model 3 Challenge race. So we try to give them as much of a buffer as we can. So if you were gonna pick a trim level to compete in the challenge with, an all-wheel drive is definitely the ideal. But you can do it with a standard range. We had one guy last year with a standard range, and he ended up third overall. So he certainly wasn't out of the mix, but there were times where you could tell the car was losing power towards the end.
Okay, so basically you're saying that you're going to set your quickest lap time with the most charge in the battery.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Now, on that point, would there be a case for a endurance race where you have to manage that sort of battery over, let's say, half an hour, even 40 minutes, and you've got people going well below what the car can do because they're going to catch up later on? I mean, it's not dissimilar to the way Formula One drivers manage their tyres, for example. Would there be scope for that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that long term, that is an opportunity that exists. And it would certainly be an interesting way to approach it, right? Because you'd almost, as a driver, have to come up with a plan and really time and execute your passes, and when you're going to use more power, in advance. So I definitely think it would be like an interesting way of doing it. Um, for us, part of it was just, how do we maximize the economics of doing this? And the more track time, the more expensive it becomes. um,
Yeah.
so the 15-minute races for us were kind of like a good happy medium. But I do think it would be really cool to watch something like that, because then it's not, it adds kind of like a whole nother layer into a strategy, right? So that would be very interesting, and it is
Yeah.
possible. You could do a 30-minute race for sure.
Yeah, I think it would be good because then you could have a whole bunch of guys back at the track just figuring out all this maths here. And we know that some drivers are really good over one lap, very, very fast. Others are very strategic. I'm thinking sort of, a lane fast versus maybe a Ayrton Senna sort of thing. So maybe those guys who don't have the blinding one lap pace, but are very smart with their driving, very smooth, they could start to win in the enduro races. Yeah. But look, I mean, this is all just really fascinating, just a way to do that. But I think you could almost turn the need to manage energy into a virtue for some races. But I totally get why you've done what you've done. It's just thinking into the future. Yeah. Now on the torque split. So what fascinated me, and I noticed this on the Cybertruck as well, was that you can go from 100% torque to the front wheels to the rear wheels, or a split. Now that's not 100% torque because obviously the motor, the total amount of torque is the sum of the front and rear motors, and if you're only going to use one of them, then it's half or thereabouts. But That must be fascinating to be able to drive a car which is front wheel drive one corner and rear wheel drive the next. I'm thinking as a driver trainer, that would just be fantastic to do that. So, what differences do you see there? And I think you said you run 40%, 60% rear. Talk to us about the torque split and how that's used and changes, etc.
Yeah, so it really depends on your personal driving style. I've seen people who use kind of the default 50-50. I think a lot of people settle in, a 55 to 65 rear bias. But others who, kind of want more oversteer, I've even seen as high as like a 70% split to the rear. And so the way that the car is programmed is that once the steering wheel's straight, it goes back to just full power. So it's really the corners where that torque bias is kind of coming into effect. So a lot of it does come down to, I'd say a person's driving style. I think those people who are more patient and kind of wait for the car to, get in the corner, get through the corner and then accelerate, prefer more of a 50-50, whereas the guys who, really want to be on the throttle early, you sort of want more of a rear split, to kind of get a little bit of oversteer, which ultimately is a little quicker. But yeah, it's interesting because if you set the torque split to like full front, the car just understeers horribly
Yeah.
everywhere. But to your point, it's also a good learning tool. And of course, if you set it to 100% rear, it's basically going to want to just slide out of every single corner. So it is interesting and really a neat feature of an EV that you just don't get in other
No.
cars, where you can really play with it and get a lot of different sort of driving attributes out of it.
Yeah, and for full driving, which is one of my other specialities, that would be the same thing as well. There's sometimes where you don't want the rear driven at all or the front driven. So that really kind of fascinated me. In the same way that in a racing car, you might change brake bias from corner to corner. Potentially, you could even do that from corner to corner, if you want to shave those last hundreds of seconds off. So, and also maybe even in the wet, because I know that I would prefer maybe definitely a rear bias because I like to be able to rotate the car under power out of that because it's fun, and also I hate tires, but in the wet I'd go, what, if I want to crack on here, I want to put a bit more to the front, so you could even change it according to the conditions. Just makes another interesting setup thing you can do. I don't think I'd be keen on doing it on the touchscreen, to be honest. I'd want a lever for that, but particularly do you make people wear, so safety-wise, do you mandate a fire extinguisher? Obviously, helmet. Do you force people to wear hands devices, that sort of stuff? Gloves.
So we of course require a helmet. We really encourage the stock belt just because it works, in conjunction with, the rest of the safety systems in the car. But if people do want to put like a roll bar in, they can certainly use a 5 or 6 point harness. We recommend a suit, gloves, etc. But ultimately, we did want to focus on this still being, accessible to someone who's, on a budget, or you know just not have it be quite to that level yet. And by focusing on the safety aspect of the driving itself, I don't think it's necessarily required, but we do encourage it. We don't require an extinguisher in the car, and honestly, the reason behind that is, if the battery were to catch on fire, an extinguisher in the car is just not going to do
Yeah.
anything. Sadly, so those rules are still evolving, as we kind of learn more. And I think most guys do opt to wear a fire suit, gloves and shoes, but not everyone. So that's a work in progress, I would say.
Cool. Now, on the subject of traction, does the Model 3 have a limited slip differential, or is it an open diff? And is there an option to put something like a LSD in a clutch one or a torque biasing one, like a Torsen or Quaife?
So the differentials are open. It does have sort of a ELSD, so to speak.
Right, traction.
Where yeah, effectively it's traction control, where it will grab each individual brake. Now you can fit a limited slip in there. There's a couple guys that have done it, but almost all of these cars are still under warranty. And of course, cracking open the drive unit and putting in a limited slip would void that warranty. So there's just not that many people who want to spend the money. But it is doable. So I'd say, looking ahead 10, 15 years, it's probably going to end up becoming a common upgrade.
Yeah. Now, the car has stability control standard, and of course that can get in the way on tracks depending on its calibration. Some of them are very, very good. The later ones, the cars have driven from Porsche and Audi on track, they're so good, you don't realize it's there, which is actually, I think, in many ways a safety problem, because drivers think they're heroes and they're not. It's the electronics doing it. But it's nice to be able to switch it off. So what's the deal with the Tesla? Can you switch it off? Do you switch it off? Does it get in the way with the stability control?
Yeah, so it's similar to that regenerative braking and the torque split. There is a slider for traction that goes from -10 to +10. And so it's fairly intrusive in the middle. At the very bottom, it's not terribly intrusive, but you can definitely feel it, especially on like corner exit. It's kind of noticeable. So it's certainly present. And for an experienced driver, you will notice it, but it will also let you spin the car, round and round in circles. So it's not preventing you from doing something silly, but it is there. And our main sponsor, Mountain Pass Performance, they do offer what they call a party box, which sort of takes that down a whole nother notch, and really sort of takes the stability and traction control out of the equation almost entirely. And I do think with that box, you can find a little bit, tenths here and there to go a little bit faster. So that is an optional modification. And I think like half the guys probably are running that. And it's sort of required if you don't have a performance. If you don't have a performance, there's no option to limit or turn off the stability control. So if you're in a dual motor, non-performance, or rear wheel drive, it's definitely something you're going to want, because otherwise you're going to be putting around quite slowly, with the traction control intervening constantly.
Yeah, I did notice on Tesla's website, it did have that slider you were saying for the performance, and I thought that would be something you want, so that you do have the option to turn it off. I just want to say that I do not recommend novices go out there and switch off any form of stability control, because inevitably, when I've taught people on track, the limit is you and your lines, not the electronics. Once you get to the point you're able to handle an oversteer snap at whatever speed, then you can switch it off. That would be my advice. If you can do your own thing, of course, and enjoy the Armco. But yeah, okay. Now, what driving technique differences are there with a EV versus the equivalent ICE car? So let's say that someone's really experienced in driving an ICE car, rear drive or whatever else. They come into an EV and they go, okay, how it's a bit like the question of if someone's really experienced in a rear drive car, they come into a front drive car for the first, there's a bunch of things you could say. So really experienced in a nice car to come into an EV, they want, what would you tell them to the sort of tips for experienced people?
Yeah, so the interesting part with an EV is it's actually very easy to drive, for a few different reasons. Obviously, you're not worried about shifting, right? And there's just like a lot less ancillary things that you need to be concerned with. But the big thing that I've noticed, that I don't think people realize until they're behind the wheel, is that you can hear every individual tire. So the feedback you get from the tires is it's almost like a whole new thing that you've never experienced before, because generally in an internal combustion engine car, you've got the engine, you've got the exhaust, you've got all these other noises going on, and you might hear the tire on like the very limit, right, when you're going over it, but often you're not getting a whole lot of feedback from them other than through the steering wheel. But in an AV, because it's so quiet, you can literally hear the left rear tire, the right front tire, each tire as it's sort of telling you what where it's at in its progression of the limit, right? And so I think from that perspective, it's sort of eye-opening, and it really allows you to find speed a lot faster. you really understand the limits of the car more intimately, because of that. And beyond that, it's fairly straightforward. You've just got the accelerator and the brake. The one thing I would say is, because EVs are generally heavy, you really need to be patient. You don't want to just sort of dive into a corner, start your turn in and then mash the throttle. You'll just constantly be losing time that way. So they like trail braking quite a lot. We've definitely found that that's a much faster way through the corner is patience and trail braking. So I'd say that's sort of like the tips I would give someone to go faster. But beyond that, just listening to the car, because it does give you a lot more feedback than I think people are used to.
Yeah, that's fascinating you say that, because that's exactly what I found off-road as well. So I had a Range Rover Sport on test. This is a PHEV, but I could run it in full electric mode. And when I was climbing up a hill in low range, exactly as you said, I could start to hear each of the tires. And as an off-road driver, to me, that was just so much information coming towards me that I wasn't used to. And my brothers go, "Wow, this is great. I can just feel it now." And even, revs are up there. So yeah, I completely get what you're talking about that. And that would just be absolutely fascinating. It would be interesting to see if that level of understanding and sort of feel could then make someone faster in a nice vehicle, if they sort of develop a bit more of a feel of the tires there. So it's just fascinating the way that each type of car has its own particular idiosyncrasies and things to go around: front drive, rear drive, ICE, etc. So yeah, that's great.
I was just gonna say, it's funny because I still have a E46 M3 track car,
Yeah.
and I it was broken for a while, so I got it back together and I finally drove it for the first time this year for a few events. And that was the thing that really stood out to me, as I was like, I can't hear what the tires are doing. It's like I've lost this, sixth sense, and
Yeah.
suddenly it's just gone. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh man, it's startling when you sort of go back to back.
Yeah, no, look, I have been on a Tesla in a track. I actually instructed one, and as you say, I could hear the tires. What I found was the acceleration was amazing, but once you get above about 150 kilometers an hour, which is about 100 miles an hour, the acceleration started to tail off. Whereas had I been in, I don't know, a Porsche 911, of something like that, at that sort of speed, you're still pulling like a steam train. Well, not, you're still pulling really hard, but the Tesla's like, and I think that's why some vehicles like the Taycan and Lotus Electra have two gears, to be able to sort of go, okay, we want to keep the power on at that sort of speed. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're completely right. On the Model 3, certainly the power really starts to drop off at higher RPM. But what's really cool is, like, on the Plaid, they certainly could have added a second gear, but
Yeah.
in one way or another, they were able to basically create this almost completely flat power curve, up straight to 200 miles an hour. So I really do think that, the drivetrain of the Model 3 right now may not be ideal for track use, but looking, at the future 10, 15 years out, I mean, there will absolutely be EVs where, you just have 1,000 horsepower all the time, at any speed. And on the Plaid too, the whole power limiting thing is less of an issue. I mean, you can run those at like 600 horsepower for a half an hour, no problem at all.
Mhm.
So definitely from that perspective, I think that, you know, the future is bright, and as that technology trickles down and becomes more affordable, you're going to be blowing past ICE cars for whole sessions.
Yeah, yeah. Now, look, on the noise, that there's another pro and another con I thought of. So, you know that when you're racing an ice car, and you can you can hear another car behind you, or around you. You can hear that. So then that gives you some form of situational awareness that, hey, there's another car there. No, I didn't spot him in my mirrors. With an EV, you're not going to have that sound situational awareness. So you've got to be a bit more alert on your mirrors, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true. Um, it's one of those things. Hopefully, if you're on a track, you're a fairly aware driver,
Yeah.
and that's not an issue. But it would be interesting in like a wheel-to-wheel race. I could definitely see that coming into play. And actually, one of the things we've sort of dabbled with so far, but haven't implemented, is pretty much amplifying the natural
Mm.
inverter noise that the motor makes. So pretty much putting a microphone, right up to the inverter, and then having a big speaker to just project it louder. And we tested it at like 100 decibels, and it was actually kind of cool. It sort of brought that feel of an exhaust to an EV, which was an interesting, a way to do it. But I think the key was, having it be natural, right? Not
Yeah.
making a fake noise, but just amplifying the noise that already existed. So, I can see, perhaps that making its way into a racing series, possibly even our own, where, you just amplify the natural sound to a level where, everyone can kind of hear it. And, I think some people would find that cool and others may not. I don't know about you guys over in Australia, but certainly here there are a number of tracks where noise ordinances are an issue, and neighbors don't like the noise and they don't want to hear it, and they're constantly trying to go after the tracks to get them shut down. So that's an interesting area where EVs can perhaps solve a problem.
Right. Well, that's exactly the case in Australia, yes. And that was actually going to be my next question, which was the pro, which was if EVs could potentially use tracks outside of the normal operating window for ice, because they are so much quieter, and therefore tracks would, I mean, at the moment, a lot of tracks will say, okay, you can't start your engines or can't start a race engine till 9 o'clock, right? And engine's got to be switched off at 5, whatever the case may be. Where with an EV, I mean, maybe we could start a race at 8 o'clock. Maybe we could run into the evening. To me, those possibilities start to open up. Would you say?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, long term, my hope is that, this allows tracks to, it benefits everybody, right? The
Yeah,
tracks are
yeah,
happy, the neighbors are happy, the people, participating in the events are happy, and ultimately, everybody, has more track time available. And it's really a win-win situation, right? I think there are certainly tracks that struggle with finances. Well, if you can operate more often, theoretically you can bring in more revenue to the track. And it also opens up more opportunities for competitors, to spend more time on the track. And I think Lime Rock Park is a great example where currently they can't run on Sundays at all. But
Oh,
if
really?
you,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you had, you know, EVs running on Sundays, that's a whole extra day where you could have operations that otherwise just wouldn't be possible.
Yeah, completely. And also in the evening, because it'd be nice just to be able to finish work, go to a track, and even do 2 hours of practice, open pit lane sort of thing. That sort of stuff would be great as well. So yeah, I'm actually really excited for the whole EV thing as well. But there's one area I wanted to explore with you a bit, and that is, I guess. The challenge of driving now in wheel-to-wheel racing, it's all about how fast you can go. So that's probably the primary thing as opposed to the operation of the car. But I don't know about you, but I still like my heel and toe downshift and managing the gears, etc. I get a real joy and reward out of that, and I think that's great. Obviously, in an EV, there isn't even a paddle shift to play with or anything else. What do you think
Yeah.
think of the idea of putting in a gearbox, so you've at least got some gears to play with there, maybe not even a clutch or anything else like that. I kind of feel it would be a bit pointless, and I don't think it would add much given what the EV is, but interested in your views.
Yeah. So, I mean, I certainly think there's a place for it, right? I think it's twofold. I've sort of tried to say all along while we've been doing this series, the point of adding an EV series is not to take away track time from people with internal combustion engines, but
Yeah,
rather to add a new dimension and bring new people into the fold who otherwise wouldn't have considered ever going to a racetrack or tracking their car. I mean, some of the biggest benefits to EVs are that they're really quite cheap, I would say, relatively speaking, to most internal combustion engine cars to track. just because the consumables are so much less. Charging is certainly cheaper than fueling a race car. You're not doing an oil change after every event. So there are a couple things like the tires that probably are a little bit of a higher expense, but the big difference is just that there's just so much less stuff to break. You're not going to be having a piston coming out of the side of a block because you misshifted or you overheated the motor. I've done close to 4,000 miles on racetracks with the Model 3s, and I've literally never had anything fail, which I just have not been able to do in any internal combustion engine car. So I definitely think, from that perspective, for people who are, on a budget or can only afford or have space for a single car, this brings a whole lot of new people into the fold. But I also understand that, a lot of people who may be interested in this are guys who came from a background of, years of internal combustion engines and manual transmissions, and ICE cars. And that's great too. So I think there is a place for something like that. And I believe is it Hyundai with their Ioniq 5N? They've actually incorporated that, that shifting into that car. And I think what I'd like to see is the option to turn it on or off, right? I think it would be a lot of fun to go to a track day and play with it. I think I'd definitely get a kick out of that. It's kind of like sim racing, right? Like, you're sim racing, and really there's no point in moving the shifter all around and pressing this clutch pedal, but it's fun, right? So if there were the option to use it, I would absolutely get a kick out of using it. But for like a competitive environment, it might make more sense to turn it off. So I think the idea to incorporate it is a good one. Even if it doesn't necessarily make you any faster, it's still, I think it's fun, and I think it's a good bridge to bring people into the fold.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think one of the misconceptions about what we do is that it's all about the speed. It's not about the speed. It's about the fun and the reward. And, so this is why cars like the MX-5 or the Miata, as you know it, the Porsche Boxster, the Lotus Elise, S2000, those have never been the fastest cars in a straight line, but I think they're up there with the most enjoyable cars, and that's really what it's about. It's, as I said, whether you end up at turn one at 200 kilometers an hour, 180 is neither here nor there. I've driven a Nissan GTR on track, and I can tell you that is fast, but it is not that much fun compared to some other cars. Sorry, Nissan owners there as well. Yeah. Now, so I come towards the end of the interview. I do want to touch on run costs, though, which you mentioned there, because one of the things I don't like about racing is spending all my time underneath the car, fiddling with gearboxes when everyone else is out practicing, and I've got qualifying next. It's just not fun. And I know some people really enjoy the car building part of it, but I don't. I hate the car building. I just want to drive the thing. And to me, what you're saying, that EVs just allow that. See, at the end of a session, I want to come back, plug the car in, go have a coffee, and relax. That's what I want to do. I don't want to be there doing anything with the engine or jacking it up or looking for my spanner set. I don't want to do that. So you must have a fair bit of data now about all these cars on track. And so what reliability problems are you seeing? What's failing, etc.? What are the issues there?
So really not, I have not seen any consistent failures other than wheel speed sensors. So the wheel speed sensor, the way that it's routed from the factory, once you put wider wheels and tires on, is absolutely susceptible to, being cut. So I'd say, if you want to do this and you want to put on some meaty tires, definitely make sure that you zip tie and electrical tape those wheel speed sensors, because they will, they're definitely a target for the wheel, and they can be damaged. So we had, I think throughout the course of last year, 2 people ran into that issue. But beyond that, I don't think we had a single mechanical failure, and they just don't seem to have issues. The batteries don't seem to have any, problems or degradation related to on-track activities. I honestly think that, supercharging the car is more detrimental to battery life than driving on the track. Because the motors are running at such, low temperatures, relatively speaking, there doesn't seem to be any issues there. A lot of the guys have decided at, 50, 60,000 miles to change the oil. but I don't see any,
So
evidence to suggest.
are we talking differential oil here, or what oil are they
Yeah,
changing? Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because when you say
it's
oil
lubricant.
change, it's normally the engine oil. I go, that's not applicable here. You must mean the diff, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's part of what we call, the drive unit,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
incorporates the motor, transmission, and diff. But the oil specifically is used to lubricate the differential and the transmission.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
some guys have changed that, but it doesn't seem like it really matters. I think like one guy had a wheel bearing that got noisy, but if he's done like 50 events on the car, so that could just be age, in miles unrelated to the track. So it's not like we're running into this issue where motors are failing or batteries are failing or suspension arms are falling out of the car or anything like that. And for me personally, like that's one of the things that really made me gravitate towards this platform is, I had the C46 M3. I've had it since 2011. And I ended up spending as much time fixing it as I did driving on the track. And it just got to the
Mate.
point where I was like, okay, this is just frustrating, right? I
Yeah.
can't go do an event without having some problem.
Yeah.
And so, I started dabbling with the Model 3 and it just worked. And then I, made some modifications to it and I went out and it just worked. And it just kept working. And I was doing, like 12 to 15 days a year and I didn't have to do anything. It just went out there and it did its thing, and I didn't mess with really anything on the car, during the events. And so for me, that was like definitely a big, like, okay, this is really cool, because it just when you end up spending more time fixing the car than driving it, it stops being all that fun.
Mate, I am. That is exactly my point. And so, and if I look at the amount of time and effort and money you put into a race car, and you divide that by the minutes on track, it would be thousands of dollars per minute. It's ridiculous. And also, it's not
Oh yeah,
just even the money; it's the time, and it's also the kind of emotional, oh God, what have I got to do here? And then you go to the track, okay, something's going to go wrong, etc. And you come back, oh, I've got to do this, I can't fix that, I've got to take it to this shop. I just don't want any of that. I just want to be able to just turn the key, a bit like sim racing. You pull out your sim,
yep,
you sit down, you go, and then you put it away and it's gone, right? And that's to me what I would like, because I'm a driver, I'm not a mechanic. Now, if people want to build a mechanical car, that's fine. It's not my jam, but I totally get where you're coming from, and that to me is why I'm excited about this. I'd actually like to see some specialized EV race cars only, really simple, like open wheeler stuff like this, really basic, really simple, and even have, I don't know, batteries which arrive at the track with you. You just drive it and go. So it's almost like sim racing but real. Which sounds weird to say, but do you get what I mean by that?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're probably still a few years out from that. I don't. The market certainly needs to, I think, sort of expand a little bit more, but absolutely it's doable. And I think that once people start to realize how awesome that is, they're going to really actually enjoy it. Because yeah, I mean, there's some guys actually in the U.S. here that ran the 24 Hours of Thunderhill with the National Autosport Association in these EVs that they built from the ground up, and they were open wheel cars, and they had quick change batteries, and they could change the batteries out in 2 minutes, and they ran a 24-hour endurance race with the cars. And unfortunately, they didn't get a whole lot of press over it, but it was actually extremely impressive. They're, as far as I know, the only guys in the world who have completed a 24-hour race with an EV, successfully. And I think that the cool part of it is it really shows, okay, well, what's possible in the future, right? If a company were to decide to invest in building a ground up EV for the racetrack, similar to like a prototype car or something along those lines, you could absolutely do it in a way that, to your point, you get in it, you go do your session, you go do a half-hour session, you know, you or you ideally you just plug it in, right? You have,
Yeah,
some
yeah,
sort of a charging situation going on there, and it just works.
yeah,
And if you build an EV for the track, it's going. You can build it such that it's really, really good for that purpose. There's just I don't think that anyone's really done it. It's more so been like, well, we built this great EV and it also works on the track, but no one has really yet said, okay, I want to build an EV for the racetrack. So I think the potential there is huge.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd sort of come back to things like power tools and things like that. You buy a power tool, you use it hard for years and years. And what maintenance do you do for your power tools, for your drill, for your saws? Nothing. It's just there. And an electric car
Yep.
is a little bit like that. It's just you plug the battery in and you go. And I, for one, I'm happy to say goodbye to maintenance costs and effort and all the grief there. So yeah.
I was gonna say it's funny you bring that up because all mechanics have basically accepted that electric cordless, power tools are the way to go,
Yeah.
compared to like air, right? And certainly fuel power tools were never a thing because they didn't make any sense at all. So, you have all these guys and they're using their, Milwaukee M18 and then they go, oh, EVs, blah, I don't like them at all. And it's like, well, that tool you use every single day, that's electric.
Yeah.
So imagine if that was a car, how simple and easy it would be, right?
Okay, Chris, any final points you want to make about this? Because to some extent, I don't know what to ask about this. So you've had experience both sides of the fields here. So I guess this might be, what question do you think I should have asked but didn't?
I think the sort of concluding thing I would say is just that where I see this being so great is just in the fact that the car has a ton of utility, right? You can use it as a daily driver, you can drive it to work, to school, drop your kids off. It's got 5 seats. It's relatively for the performance, not terribly expensive. Again, it can do lap times comparable to a brand new M3, but at half the cost. At least here in the US. I know pricing over there might be a little bit different. And again, back to what we were just talking about, the maintenance is so much less. You're not doing these constant oil changes. It's not breaking all the time. You can drive it on the street, do all that, and then you can show up to a Model 3 challenge race and you just hop in and go. You don't have to change anything around. The car's already ready to go. One of the big things that we didn't even touch on yet is, so you've put in these racing pads, right? Well, if you put in a racing pad on a normal street car and you come to a traffic light, the whole time all you hear is and it's this
Yeah,
terrible noise.
yeah.
And
Been there, done that.
people in a
Yeah,
crosswalk look at you and go, "Oh my God, what's going on with that car?" Well, with
yeah,
the regenerative braking, it's a complete non-issue. You can put
yeah.
race pads in, and the brakes never make a sound.
Oh,
And then you can just
cool.
go to the
Yeah,
race.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like those weird little things that you'd never think of, but then you can go to a racetrack and you don't have to swap the pads; they're just ready to
yeah,
go. And then you go back to the street and you don't even think about it. So I think, that's one of the main advantages of if you're somebody who, again, either only has the space or the money for one car and you don't want to deal with a truck and you don't want to deal with a trailer, but you still want to do, competitive track driving.
yeah.
It's just an awesome platform. And I just don't think that there's anything out there currently, as like a new car that can give you that same experience. So I think
Yeah.
that's really where the potential lies, and as more people realize that, there's going to be more of a shift towards, saying, "Hey, this is actually kind of great."
Yeah, oh look, see, that is the sort of little detail I find fascinating. But yeah, I know what you mean, right? I mean, my current track car's an orange Lotus Elise, which gets attention like you wouldn't believe. But I put DS 3500 pads, DS 3000 pads in it. Screeched, right? So I was coming with the top down, the traffic lights, screech, screech. I mean, I could not have had more attention on that car. It's like, okay, I'm just going to engine brake. But yeah, as you say, with the regen, that problem goes away because you don't use the friction brake. So fascinating details. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I knew this conversation was going to be interesting, but it's been even more interesting than I thought. I really want to say thank you and for explaining all of this. And we're way behind you in Australia here. We don't have anything like that. Wish you all the very best with the Model 3 challenge into the future, and maybe we can talk again some other time and see how you're going. Because I'm sure you have a lot to learn in a few months' time as well, and as it evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate your time. It's been a lot of fun to talk about it. It's something that I'm definitely passionate about, and I really hope that in the future people have more of an open mind towards it, and start to see how this can really help the sport grow in general. Because I think that's where one of the biggest opportunities lies is, I think we all agree that we really love this. We love cars. We love
Yeah, yeah.
racing. But we also realize that it's a generally really expensive sport that only a very small amount of the population participates in. So if we can grow it to reach new people, and really start to grow the sport in general, that helps keep the tracks we love around, and keeps them from getting shut down, and brings the sport just to a whole new market that otherwise I don't think it have ever found it. So we've doubled our events for 2024 compared to 2023, and I hope to continue that trend in the future. And we'll see how it goes.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. All the best, and keep in touch.